on it, buddy. And then, if you'll just do a full system shutdown of all systems,
Okay, just the hard, okay.
the TV, and the laptop, do a full shutdown.
Yeah.
That is it, buddy. You are in. Friends, I'm sorry to not be with you for this final session, but I'm gonna go into a hospital, so farewell.
Be excited. Prayers are with the family.
Yes. John, to do this too. I'm gonna open up, we have a brand new adult library right here on the other side of the wall. That used to be an old counseling office, so I'm gonna open the door, y'all can peek at it on the way out, it'll be available every Sunday morning, and I got a few more accoutrements to put together, but take a look at it on the way out, and if somebody will close the door when you are finished, that'd be great. Thanks, y'all.
The email it looks like it came from Josh at 8:22 this morning. No, nobody got it.
Some Caitlin got
You
it.
got it? Okay.
I didn't.
Got it.
I've looked in my junk. 8 something, no,
No,
I got nothing between 8 AM and 10 AM. In that account, and between 8.
you know what, you may. Caitlin, Colton, Natalie, Julie, B, Clark, Mom, Dad. Deb, no. You were not on the original distro for this.
Oh, I was not.
Yeah, so that's-
First class and it's in the. I get the class, but I never signed up, so.
I registered and I didn't get it.
Reed
either.
Baker.
It's not you.
Joan,
Oh, that's Clark, or Clerk.
I got something on 8/22.
Okay, yeah.
Joan didn't get it either.
I didn't get it either.
What's your email?
Marie.baker2@icloud.com.
I didn't get it either.
I don't think Marcella got it.
Is it vastly different than?
It is not, it's just that we're gonna have, it's actually the same thing. If you have last week's bulletin number 7. It's the same thing. That's just, what
Exactly
we
the
can-
same.
it's the exact same.
Then
bulletin.
I can get it out. one.
Okay, cool.
Never mind.
All right.
It's the same as last week's. I think I got last week.
Yep, it's the exact same. We're not doing a separate one for, because this is the last one. All right, we get. Really, I mean. The Chinese could not have hamstrung the Department of Defense any better than we do ourselves over encrypting emails and.
Same sign.
I got last week. That-
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And Josh hit live, right? You hit record.
Think so.
Okay, before you left, if not.
It's recorded. This is a red thing up in the upper left.
Got it, okay. Awesome. So we'll go ahead and get started. Last week we went a little long, longer. Yeah, this week, it's the last class or session in this Sunday school class. And we have run out of chapters. The epilogue was, I think, the reading assignment, which sort of wraps everything together. It pretty quickly and concisely on the author's part. But we'll go through our normal opening ritual and then have a discussion, mostly, I think, on, I'd like to gather everybody's thoughts, personal thoughts about how, not about the book would be great, about the author and his journey, but one of our objectives for this class was to use the tools that the author sort of shared with how he went through his own journey. Okay, and he's a PhD in history, so his process was very in-depth, detailed, structured. But I think there was a number of tools. Good morning, Diane Fleming. That we can apply as lay people in terms of not being history PhDs in department heads. Can use it ourselves, both to look within ourselves and how we feel and to challenge some of our core beliefs, you know, not to refute them to the degree that he did, that may not be necessary. But to use that as a way of looking and questioning or reflecting upon, you know, our own experiences growing up. Okay, and I'll share some of mine that I went back and wanted to, you know, take a look at. But I think that would be the main point that we would do today. If there's still issues about, you know, how is the Army handling rebasing and things like that, you know, we can discuss that as well. And I was not able to track down any definitive word on what West Point is doing with regard to all of the memorialization of Lee, who's pretty much the only Confederate, you know, that is held in any esteem by, you know, having roads, gates, housing areas, awards, you know, barracks, all of that named after him. Okay, so for those of us that have the sheet, we can go ahead and do the opening prayer corporately. No, well, I will come over here with the two of you.
All right.
Okay, so join me in the opening prayer. Oh, Holy Spirit, giver of life, spread fuels of lungs this very moment. You are a all powerful Spirit.
Be it
Guiding us today against the silence or racism in this land, that we might be filled with your words that heal, liberate, and offer hope in our day. Let us speak and let our lives in tandem with our words be a way of witness in the world for you and the liberation of your Black people. God, amen. Yes. Okay, and we'll take turns going around and doing the commitments of presence. I'll go ahead and do the first one, and then we'll just go around, and if you don't have it in front of you, no worries. Be fully present. Set aside the usual distractions of things undone from yesterday, things to do tomorrow, and things impinging on the present through technology. Who wants to go next?
Okay, got it.
Yep.
Listen generously. Listen intently to what is said. Listen to the feelings beneath the words. Listen to each other as you would listen to scripture, attentively, mindfully, and open to the holy.
We come as equals. No person's gifts, limits, or experiences are more or less important than another's.
It is never share or die. You will be invited to share stories, but you will determine the extent to which you want to participate.
No fixing. We are not here to change anyone else's mind or to fix them.
It's been judgment. By creating a space between judgment and reactions, we can listen to another person and to ourselves more fully.
Turn to wonder. If you find yourself becoming judgmental, cynical, try turning to wonder. I wonder what my reaction teaches me. I wonder what they are feeling.
I found it. Practice confidentiality care. What is said here stays here, and what is learned here goes out.
Welcome.
Yeah, welcome.
Welcome discomfort and its location. Move against an instinct to construct a mental space of safety or to check out.
And I will wrap up the last one. Love the questions themselves. Let your questions linger. Release the compulsion to answer them or to have them answered. Okay. So I would be willing to, I would share my own, but I will canvass the group first. If anybody wants to share personal reflections that they might have had while going through the different lessons or chapters of the book. And it can be, being shocked right up front when we started with the last chapter, the verdict, right? With being presented with a refutation of what you may have learned growing up about the Civil War. If you were indoctrinated involuntarily or otherwise into the lost cause myth, and then had that chapter sort of set in front of you in a very logical yet forceful way, and had feelings about that, and how maybe since that was a lesson, those feelings may be tempered or waxed or waned over time as we went through the author's journey. Or it could be that you looked at one of the chapters about his young life, when he grew up in Arlington or grew up moving with his family through the South. And he, told first about how he participated in that as a youth and, how that formed him. But then after, he started this introspection, he went back and in the subtitles to those early chapters were, the hidden racism of my hometown, or the hidden racism of, my adopted hometowns. Okay. And where you too might have seen hidden or blatant racism as you were growing up, and how that may have affected you. Or it could be like the author, you felt pissed. Like the author said a couple of times, he felt pissed off that he did not have the facts, and therefore, in his formative years, made serious life choices, to venerate Lee and want to be a Southern gentleman in the Virginian fashion. Okay, but not having access to the facts, like you would go and you might get them from your church, from your pastor in the pulpit, or your teacher at the front of the classroom, okay, or from the textbooks or that you read, or the books you read growing up, or the movies you saw, okay. Any thoughts? Anybody want to share anything about that?
I will. So when we started this book, I'll admit to one time sit down and read it all because it was that interesting to me. But I remember an incident when I was in 5th grade. I grew up in a small West Texas town. I considered my best friend Louise. Louise was Black. And I remember, Louise and I couldn't have sleepovers. Never really questioned that. We went to a Girl Scout thing, traveled in a bus, and we were supposed to come to a certain town and get to go to the swimming pool. Out there, swimming pools are kind of they're rare. And I remember we had stopped, we all were dressed, and then we were told to get right back on the bus and go home, and nobody explained why. And so I could hear in the back the adults saying, well, it's because we have a couple of Black girls. And I wouldn't let them in. So I was probably, this was about the mid to late 60s. So that has stuck with me. I mean, it brought it back up, it has stuck with me. I feel like I'm not racist, and everybody says that, but I really felt like that was something that really stuck with me, that people were treated different than I was because I was white and they were colored, and that was not okay. That was truly not okay. The other thing I learned was, if this was recently within the last couple of years with all that's gone on, is I never knew about the Black Wall Street and the race riots in Tulsa.
Yeah, I never knew that.
There's no idea recently.
And it to me was so shocking to be 60-some years old, having lived not near Tulsa. I did have great grandparent and great uncles and aunts that lived in Tulsa, But also being of the Plains, you might have thought you would have heard about it in some kind of a history lesson. And there was when I felt pissed. Pissed at something that was so blatantly racist, so, I mean, killing and bombing people. To me, that was just unthinkable. And so, you know, again, I was just sitting there going, I was pissed. And then I've also learned that maybe I can see through this, I can see systemic racism a little bit better. And it's starting to come to my awareness for it. And we talked about this last time we were here, was about the Jason All being solved and where it was. And then last week or the week before last, when the Florida Board of Education had put those learning peaks or learning things in about Black people getting skills from their
Right, it would help them after slavery.
you know, so I guess I have a heightened awareness of systemic racism because of reading this book. And hopefully I will figure out ways in which I can bring those to life when I see them. Maybe participate into some kind of you know, march or sit-in or whatever it may be, or writing letters or to the government or whatever. I just think that it's definitely given me a new cause.
Thank you. That's great. I mean, I that is the number one hope that Josh and I had. Besides just reading a really good book. I'm sort of informally doing it on some of the teams that I travel around my work with. I have, you know, many of whom I went to school with at West Point or were in the Army or, you know, whatever. And, you know, I've said, hey, have you read this book? And, you know, when we get together and stuff, we'll talk, you know, talk about it and be like, man, we had no idea. Now we're all, you know, within 3 or 4 years of my age, all white, all male, you know, and so reading like this is one of the guys said it was like watching a mirror break or something. You know, you hold the mirror up and just have the mirror shatter. Anyone else?
I have 2 thank yous I'd like to share, one with you, John, and one with Marcelo, because in the course of this class, I have brought up questions based on my Southern upbringing. I can sit in the same, I grew up in Texas, but I could almost sit in the same lecture hall with Ty and go, yeah, that's how it was taught. In pointing out things like, throughout Europe, there are no memorials to Hitler or the Nazis or fascism in any way, shape, or never thought of it that way. Lee was the loser. Why? And Marcelo, bless you for pointing out that private monuments of grief should not necessarily be put in public places. When I'm thinking about all of the statues to Lee, put there. I understand the grieving widows wanting to memorialize their spouse, son, father, but it didn't need to be a great big giant statue to the losing general. I had never thought of it that way. I want to thank y'all for that. At the same time, I still don't know your name, Roxanne. It's what other history are we missing?
Yeah, yes.
What other aside from the big ones? I actually, at one point when reading it the very first time, Eli Whitney didn't invent cotton gin out of thin air by himself. I'd be willing to bet he had a slave right there beside him helping create it. Okay, sure, they may say the slaves gained skills, but what skills did they bring with them that we picked up and they've incorporated into what we do? And just because we were colonializing and making them more Western European doesn't mean it was right.
Yeah.
So I want to know what other history have I missed that has not been published, because
So I think we saw that in 2 places. Both when the author talks about Washington and Lee and the senior professor who the Black gentleman who started out as a janitor, then went through the school and then, you know, went all the way to being now a senior member of the faculty that invited him back. That whole episode would have been lost, right? When we went through and last week and Googled the names, the new names of all of those forts, okay, man, that's a lot of history there. You know, and it's not just Fort Moore, both to Hal Moore and his wife, right? So I mean, there's a lot of history there that just got buried. You know, they could have been celebrated. And one of the things that I've learned, because we actually did at my work when everybody during COVID, when we all had, you know, the George Floyd, the protest, you know, we had a whole day of shutdown in our work, and everybody joined these VTCs, and they were led by people of color, not just Black, you know, could have been Hispanic, whatever, and you had all kinds of options to dial into these. And I dialed into one that was a Black colleague of mine who was a year or two ahead of me at West Point, and he talked for an hour about, and his brother was also in the Army, but I did not go to West Point. He talked for an hour about his feelings about being based around the South and driving into Fort Benning, driving into Fort Bragg, driving into Fort Gordon, you know, all these places where he was based, and how that made him feel. And here I couldn't even have named, before I read this book, the 9 bases that were named after Confederate generals, right? But a completely different perspective, you know, and how important it is, you know, through hearing his stories. And I think Fort Lee is now, I forget the 2 names, but one of them's hyphenated. The first name, there's a woman. And I think that's the first fort named for a woman, you know, and how important it is, you know, to have in an institution that is supposed to be representative and serving of all the citizens in the country, how important it is to have people in senior leadership positions and, you know, exemplified and memorialized through history that look like you. Not a problem for me, not a problem for him, you know, more of a problem for all of you and a real problem for you. Okay. You know, but if you don't have any expectation that what you're doing could matter, and no matter how good you do it, that you may never advance based on merit in one of the true, you know, meritocratal institutions in the world, then, you know, how demoralizing that can be. And then how much talent you can lose by people, you know, leaving because of that. Well over half your potential talent. So, but thank you for that.
Were you gonna check on something?
Oh, I was just gonna build off what you said. 2 things. One is what you said about what are we missing? This is hard. I mean, if it took this guy, Diane and I had talked about this, if it took him with a PhD in history, it took him decades for it to get through his thick head that there was a problem. This is hard work, and that's why we have to have classes like this, and we have to talk about it, and we have to make sure that the kids hear about it, despite what some people in our government think that kids need to be sheltered from this stuff. They don't. And it's hard, and we have to do the work and do all that kind of stuff. But going back to the skills thing, very interestingly, I was looking for Googling something to do with Maryland, because where I'm from. And they just had an article about the Catoctin furnace. So Catoctin Mountains is where Cape David is, just west of Washington, DC, Baltimore area, in the mountains on the way down to where I grew up, way out there. And the Catoctin furnace was actually built during the Revolutionary period. And it was a place where iron was made and was used for the Americans used it to make things during the Revolutionary War and after. It goes back that far. They have just discovered in the last couple decades, I think they found some of them in the 70s, but then nobody did anything about it. It's only now coming public. The graves of 35 African people who had been enslaved there. And they were the ones who brought the iron working skills that helped us get our independence from Britain. Wow, and that story's never been told. So they're all, the stories are everywhere.
Does anybody remember, and I just tried to look it up, and I'm not sure that he explicitly stated when or what caused him to, when he flipped.
Yeah, it's in here.
So he said he had done a 5-minute video on there about was the Civil War about slavery, and he talked about that it debuted. It was an issue of timing. It debuted on the website, I think, right around the time of the massacre in 2015, where the guy went in with the whites, right, Charleston, in the black church. But so that I think was, he pointed at when he became notorious for his talk about was the Civil War about slavery, and he says, of course it was. But later on in the epilogue here, he talks about he now feels so strongly that he's aware that when he starts talking about this, and I'm sure we picked up, it borders on righteousness. He pointed that out about himself, but that, I don't know if there was a light switch moment or if that was a dimmer switch. You know, if it was like, all right, well, you know, now I'm like, you know, a PhD in history, and I'm looking at, he's primarily a war or a military historian. And so when you're at West Point, you know, a lot of what we learned there was tactics. They're not teaching us what the Civil War was about necessarily when I was there. Now they do, and I think that's important too. But there's a lot of, you know, moving pieces on the battlefield, you know, terrain, timing, use of cavalry, that kind of stuff, teaching us the basics. And so I think when he started to look at that kind of stuff, he noticed that, you know, he was allowed to continue to, you know, memorialize Lee in his own mind because he was teaching the tactics, Lee's generalship, rather than Lee's character and personage, right? But I don't think that there was a point in the book where, you know, there was a light switch thing where it was like, oh, wait, you know, and now we have why do we have forts named after these traitors? You know, I think it was more like I said, like a dimmer switch where all of a sudden he's slowly waking up to this. And at the same time, he's learning more facts. You know, he's also now like, darn it, you know, that makes me feel bad. And then he starts going on this journey of deconstructing his own childhood and you know, challenging his own beliefs.
Yeah, it's page 182 in my book. It says he was, it's when he went back to teaching military history, and it said, finally, after far too many years, I had my aha moment. I understood the question, but not the answer.
Mhm.
I started running around campus looking for every monument, every memorial to Lee, and finding them everywhere. West Point might have more monuments to Lee than my alma mater, Washington and Lee. How did this happen? I asked, but no one knew or cared. As a historian, I knew how to solve this problem, and that's what. So that was, I knew he'd said it.
Yeah, no, and you're right. So that's heavily marked up. But even then, that was just about West Point.
Right.
But then I think that's a jumping off platform
Exactly.
that causes him to starburst in a lot of directions. No, great.
A part of me still struggles with renaming the bases. Not because I want to glorify Confederate people, but because those bases are such a part of the community and are known not so much for the person they were named for, but when you go to Bragg, you do something. When you go to Hood, you do these things. The cavalry is based at Hood. And so that's a personal struggle for me that I need to overcome, yes. Because I cannot see it from the minority perspective of how hurtful that name is. But there's also a part of me that's like, well, I know it is named for Captain Hood, But that's because I'm Texan and he was Texan and it's part of my Texas roots. But does the person from Wisconsin who's coming down here to be part of the cavalry at Fort Hood? Is it ever written anywhere? This is for this Confederate person. I guess that's my question.
I would tell you that the minorities probably know. Because every base that you get assigned to when you come in, no matter what rank you are, unless you're like the commanding general, you go through an in-processing that includes orientation to, you know, what other units are on the base, what's the mission of the main units on the base, who's the base named after, and the history of the base. And I would say that your argument I would turn your argument of, well, you know, it means something to the community. Well, that's part of the problem. The community needs to be made aware that, you know, even though it might Fort Hood or Gordon may have been, or Benning, I think was just a specific example, was chosen by the locals, you know, or at least approved or supported by the locals. The locals need to look at themselves as well. And maybe the Army, you know, Department of Defense, late to the party as well, but still ahead of society in a lot of places, you know, might be a forcing function for that.
I only bring it up because I grew up in San Antonio. If you ask any Air Force person, they all did basic at Lackland.
Yep. Yeah.
And who was Lackland? I don't know. Who was Lackland?
Well, I have no idea, probably an Air Force person. But the author also says that, you know, the Army is unique in having this particular issue because Annapolis wasn't formed until maybe 2 years before the Civil War. And the Air Force up until, and you can still go into the Air Force from West Point until very recently, but the Air Force Academy has only been around since, the Air Force is a branch since 47.
Yeah.
The Academy since maybe 50s or 60s, something like that.
Yeah.
So Lackland was actually named after an Army general.
Oh, really?
Brigadier General Frank Lackland, who was commissioned in the regular army after serving in District of Columbia National Guard.
And what year did he serve?
Don't know. It doesn't have.
May have been an Army or Army Air Corps.
It probably was, yeah. And it's not named until 1948. Yeah, it was part of Kelly Field before that.
Yeah, so that would have been 48. If he was a brigadier general in 48, then he definitely was in the Army Air Corps. Yeah. But I mean, that's fascinating now. Everybody, you know, and think of all of this stuff, you know, what's this base named after? What's this, you know, named after and why, and you know, the origins of it. Did anybody find themselves going back through like their childhood and thinking about how they grew up, the schools they attended, the demographics of the schools, you know, what stuff was in your textbooks, anything like that?
I know the college that I went to, and my daughter graduated from, well, they had were named McMurray, and their mascot was Indians. And obviously they have changed that. And they did this really neat thing in homecoming where they had teepees in various tribes. And we would have this thing that the elementary kids would come through and you had to know about your tribe, you had to know time frame and all this kind of stuff. So it was an educational experience. But I remember the outrage, what, we're changing it from Indians to Warhawks and stuff like that. But you know, I've come to the conclusion that sometimes being politically correct isn't a bad thing. It's more of being kind, being aware.
Yep.
Having maybe not yourself first, but others first.
John?
Please.
Oh, somebody on.
Trying to come off mute there, Mom?
I'm here. Yes. Along with, we didn't have the Southern experience, but I'm about the same age as your author. We grew up with the Gone with the Wind and the romantic idea of the Confederacy. No emphasis. I mean, you read the book, you saw the movie, no emphasis on slavery. And the major historian I remember was Turner, who talked about the conflict, the Civil War, as westward expansion and more in economic, political terms. Kansas and Missouri and Dred Scott, and it wasn't slavery per se. It was who would be in control of how the country expanded. I mean, that was the whole emphasis, as well as the romantic idea of the Confederacy, with no issue of slavery or, I mean, that was there, but that was not the emphasis.
And no, thank you. But I think that the point about westward expansion, so you can still sit there after having read this and see how obvious the institutionalization of the lost cause mythology was. But guess what? It landed in fertile ground. Because if you look back at, like my mom said at times, what was another word for westward expansion? What do you learn? What did every kid learn? What was the phrase? Manifest destiny. And what was at the heart of manifest destiny?
It was God's intention.
It was God gave the white man the right to expand across the United States from sea to shining sea, right? And make that their own. Okay. Anybody remember the Monroe Doctrine? Okay, what did the Monroe Doctrine say? It was a message, it was a policy that was established primarily to the Europeans, the white Europeans, to stay out of our backyard. The Western Hemisphere is ours. Okay, but why was it ours? It was ours to take over and exploit as we saw fit, not as how you saw fit. Okay, so both of those were early, policies and more than just they were the expression of this idea that it was our God-given right to do whatever we wanted in this land, regardless of in the unspoken context, regardless of who's already there. Right. So, I mean, that is, you want to go even a little bit deeper. So when the lost cause myth comes along, it lands on, okay, if that's how they, want to portray it or whatever, that's fine. We're just going to keep going with, this thing over here. Okay.
But does the New York atheist for this Southern girl. Does the New York textbook, how does it touch on slavery? Does it never talk about it being wrong, or do they care? I mean, I'm not gonna say they don't care, but does it not impact the history they put down and present to their children?
That's a great question. I don't know. I would imagine that it's handled, differently in different regions. I mean, how would slavery be dealt with, or this issue of the cause of the Civil War up in, Wisconsin or out in the Dakotas? That's a great question.
There's actually a textbook approval agency. It's in Texas, and they actually govern the majority of textbooks, at least history textbooks, that are going out in the United States. So for some reason, Texas became the spot where all of those textbooks are reviewed and edited and then approved, and they go out to every other state. So Texas has a lot of say what other states textbooks say. And if you know anything about
the rest of the world, no, that's interesting though, Marcelo.
As a former 5th grade teacher, I was on several years of social studies book selections for Round Rock ISD, and Texas, for the book companies, always had specific Texas editions of US history that were not used in any other state but Texas, but because Texas was so large, the book company produced books just for Texas, whereas other states might be all the New England states or all the Midwestern states or something, but Texas books were always only for Texas.
I would imagine that just hiding behind the issue of, you know, impropriety, or it's, you know, it's too bad to tell our little kids about. That, you know, it's like sex ed, same thing. I mean, you know, what's the right age, how much detail, all of that. I'm sure in slavery is not the only issue as well. I mean, I would imagine that there's parts of the country, you know, where the, you know, forced relocation of Indian tribes is the same thing.
I'm gonna say, in my last few years of teaching, I retired in 2011. But we had our 5th grade, it's called History Alive.
Mhm.
And there were wonderful activities, and one of the activities relating to slavery was you took your kids out into the hallway, laid them down in the hallway and talked about the Middle Passage. And they had to lay down, you know, you had boys here, girls here, they had to lay down on the floor, heads against the wall, arms touching. And then you read them all the information about what was the Middle Passage like, how long was it? We usually hit it in the year or in the time period that it was about around the 16th week of school. And it was about a 16-week trip. So you could say, think about the first day of school till now. You've been in this ship all this time, chained together like this, you know, and it was very moving. And then it was a great series because they had a notebook that they had to do a lot of recording their own things. So then you went back in the months when they could record, write about your experience in the Middle Passage, you know, but there was a lot of interaction like that, not just reading questions. It was great.
Yeah.
And, but you know, even in all that, slavery was never expressed as bad good. It was just, this is it, this is what happened. It's very factual.
That's a start.
Yeah, you can also just Google any state's education, learning, what they're supposed to be learning. And that could probably answer your questions. I'm trying to go quickly through New York to see if there's anything that, you know.
I think, I would imagine that there's probably, as the pendulum swings back and forth, right? Depending on what state you land in, it's probably somewhere along that spectrum. So stuck in, you know, doubling down on the current, you know, way of doing it, or the traditional way of doing it. And then there's some that have swung all the way over here, and, you know, where they're consciously bringing out elements of what, you know, the standard learning, like Lewis and Clark. Okay, you know, everybody knows Lewis and Clark, but who were the Indians that were guiding? Well, everybody knows Sacagawea, right?
All
But-
of the women know Sacagawea.
But, you know, right, but I mean, so, but about her, and, you know, they romanticize
Right.
that as well, where she's probably like a 15-year-old girl who got kidnapped out of her tribe
She
and forced to
actually
come
had a
along.
baby.
Yeah,
that-
right,
That particular,
yep, but I mean, you know, so, it's probably back and forth, that everybody's in there somewhere. I remember, when I came back from Bosnia, I was a battery commander, and we got rid of our old howitzers and we fielded new howitzers. And it was about the same time where the artillery was going through, and all the artillery units, they figured out that there were, he talks about battle streamers in the book, right? And so somebody figured out that there was about as many howitzers in the army, on the active army, as there were battle streamers on the army flag. And so somebody had the great idea of going through and naming, you know, from like if you lined up all the artillery units in a line from based on their lineage, the newest, the oldest to the newest, and then you just went through and put the oldest battle on the first howitzer and the newest battle on the last one. Well, my battery ended up in the Indian Wars period. And so I went from 8 down to 6 howitzers, and they were all the French and Indian force, right? And so as part of, we had this big christening ceremony that we had to plan where, you know, the soldiers they'd unveil the names on they actually painted the name on the howitzer tube, and then gave each of the section chiefs, usually a sort of a mid-grade NCO, a staff sergeant, would read something about, you know, the significance of the battle on. And so I told these guys when we came back from Bosnia, I said, all right, these are going to be your new gun names, your tube names. Go to the library. We didn't have the internet back then. This was like in the late 90s, 97. Go to the library, research this battle, and then prepare your speech. And then I put their lieutenants in charge of, you know, making sure that they were appropriate and all of that, right? And so the you know, 2 or 3 days before this ceremony, we were having all these, you know, general come out, all these colonels and very senior people, young guys now, come out to this ceremony. And my lieutenants came to me and they said, we got a problem. It's like, what's up? They said, a lot of the NCOs aren't really happy about the names on their howitzers. And I was like, nothing I can do about that, right? And I said, why are they unhappy? You know, is it not cool enough or whatever? And he goes, no, they went to the library and learned about the battles that their howitzers are going to be named after, and they're not real happy about it. And I said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, you know, Sergeant Compton, the most outspoken one, of course, who rallied the other ones to come to the lieutenants, said he had, you know, the Seminole something, right? You know, some battle. And in effect, what happened was this artillery unit pulled up in the middle of the Everglades, put their howitzers online, filled them with grape shot. The battery commander went into the Indian chief and said, pack up now, we're moving you. This is now land owned by the US government, and you got like an hour to break camp. And they were like, no, this is our holy. And so they fired the artillery into the Indian camp. Okay, great shot, you know, and wiped out the whole tribe. And that is one of the flags that Battle Streamers on. And I was like, okay. And before, you know, the expectation was, of course, to talk about who commanded the artillery unit that went and fought in this glorious battle, and you know, what was the great thing? Well, we now own Florida, and you know, and so we get out there, and I was like, hey, listen, I'll take the, you know, punch, you know, from the leadership. Have them write whatever they want. You know, if they want to write about, you know, how terrible that battle was, and so got up there and I got, you know, my 2-star general, 2 1-star generals, my Davardi commanders, the full colonel, our supported brigade commander, all these big, you know, wigs are out there in the field, and you know, the first guy gets up and reads his battle, and I could just feel, you know, the senior officers are like, what are we listening to? You know, and so, you know, after we went through all 6 of them, then I got out and I gave like a little speech and said, you know, okay, let this be a lesson. You know, back when this stuff occurred, you know, this was what the Army did. Those people were following their orders. You didn't question orders. You know, the Indians were not viewed as, you know, same as the white people, as, you know, and, you know, think about the, you know, after that, the Civil War, and we went through the same thing. More than half of the soldiers in my batteries were minorities, you know, which is typical of the artillery, Hispanic and Black, you know, you know, and then afterwards, you know, the senior leader, I said, you know, my Davardi commander came up and goes, well, that wasn't quite the ceremony I was expecting. Yeah, but you know what, sir? That's the one you got. because you wanted to we didn't put these flags on the streamer. I said, the stuff that we did in Bosnia over the last year, right now, we think that separating, these people out and supporting one ethnic group over another, that was our current policy. We spent a year there. Nobody questioned it. We did what we said. Woe be unto us 100 years from now, when somebody looks back at us, and this is before 9/11 and everything, and judges us for doing, what we were, but we can tell a better story, so anyway.
Interesting.
Yeah. Hey, it's what does he say? What is he quotes John Updike, about the truth is uncomfortable, and it hits you in the face sometimes.
And that's what, some people would think it was weird that we did a Sunday school class on this book. I mean, other than Robert isn't being a good Christian gentleman, I mean, that, and hold on. But, when you look at the decline in church attendance, church membership, church participation over the last 20 years in the United States, I think the majority of people, they don't want to just come and feel good. But it's hard. But I think, I think that's why, 15 or so people have showed up here during the summertime. I don't think, when's the last time we had 15 people in a summer Sunday school class?
Yeah,
I mean, because we recognize that we've got to be part of the change.
Yep.
So
Well, this class is a direct line to the commitment that Hope made in the session that Hope made to self-identifying as a PCUSA Matthew 25 church, right? Following the 6 righteous acts, and that rests firmly in the outreach commission, how we partner with folks to do things like clothe the naked and feed the poor, give drink to the thirsty, right? But there was also those 3 other areas, revitalize your congregation, identify and dismantle structural racism, and eradicate systemic poverty. Right. So these are the tools.
Yeah.
You need to do that. If you don't know how to be honest and sit down, and it's not an issue of being dishonest, it's just not having the tools and knowing where to start and where to look. How are you going to now look around here and view things that are done here differently? And say, is the Confederate flag down at the state capitol, is that a memorialization of the Confederacy, or is that an identification that yes, Texas was in the Confederacy, one of the 6 flags that flew over the Capitol, and recognize that and deal with it? It's not glorifying it, it's part of the history, but there are definitely things that are being glorified that don't need to be as well. So and this, I think, is in the same vein as the class that we taught before COVID about God and the Gay Christian. Okay, where we examined all of the. Oh, it was during COVID? It was like right at the beginning, right? It was right at the beginning. Which gave us the tools to actually look differently at some of those things, the clobber passages, right? And deconstruct those and see how they were weaponized, right? And there was mythology there as well. And I think that when we look into how to sort of keep this same type of class going, there's a book out there now. It's been out for a little bit, but it's sort of making the rounds, called Remember the Alamo.
Yeah.
Right? Which,
is that what it's called? I thought it was called something else.
or maybe Forget the Alamo, right? It has Remember the Alamo and it
Yeah.
crossed out and Forget. Yeah, you're right, Marie. Yeah.
I started reading it and then I got distracted
Yeah.
and finished it, so I need to go get it.
So, but I think that's the first step, is like he says, how do we look at the past and not repeat it in the future? And he says facts and education, right? And so that's primarily, I think, what this is. And that's why we, again, started with the last chapter first, put the facts out there, and then went through his journey, you know, so that we could follow along and maybe reflect on that ourselves.
Well, thank you. It's been a really good class.
No, it's been fun. It's been fun, you know, moderating it and working with Josh, and it always helps when you have a bunch of people, like you said, Marie, 15 people or so, and great participation from online as well, and people going back in and looking at the recordings. So awesome.
John, I would just like to say it's been a pleasure for Dad and I to see some of your church members and hear their thoughts. It's really been very nice for us. Thank you for including us.
Oh, my pleasure. And Dad, thanks for the book a couple years ago. I appreciate it. And y'all are Williamsburg Presbyterian Church, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
PCUSA as well. So you got to turn around and get them Matthew 25, right?
No, it's been a pleasure.
Great. All right. Any closing thoughts from anyone? Final thoughts on the class? No?
So what do we do from here?
Yeah,
I mean,
what kinds
what's-
of change
what's
in looking
next?
at hope would we
Well,
see as
so
change as a result of doing this?
So I think that those are great questions, and I think that may warrant a follow-on class in the fall. Maybe looking at next education cycle. We have a couple other things we want to get in as well, but maybe taking the lessons that we learned from here about how to identify structural racism and looking differently at things that, of course that makes sense. We've always done it that way, or, something like that. And then furthering that look within our own denomination in the broader church as well.
Because as I'm sitting here, I'm not, and I must be missing, I may be missing something, maybe the rest of you see something, but I'm not seeing a lot that we need to change here at Presbyterian and what and how we do things, but maybe there is, and I'm just oblivious to it.
That may be the case. I mean, as a church here at Hope, we may be doing okay, but again, once people arrive here. But one of the things about God in the Gate Christian that we figured out at the end of that class was we needed to do a different kind of inviting all to worship God. Rather than we're a very welcoming church once people showed up here. But in studying that book in the discussions, we realized that not all were going to show up. We had, and that's not our mission anyway. It's not welcome all to invite who show up. Our mission is invite all to worship God. And so it showed us ways to reach out into the community, specifically the LGBTQIA plus community, to send out the right messages that all are invited. Okay, starting with our invite all policy that was written right about the same time we did that class.
Yeah, and it's like someone said, oh, I think you said Roxanne about maybe in addition to going to LGBTQ going to pride events and talking about hope, maybe we should be showing up at anti-racism events.
Yep.
And being present.
Yep.
Being solid, being allied in the community.
And
those who are affected, because realistically, we're never going to be a majority minority congregation here, where we live, where we are, where our community is.
Mm-hmm.
People are not going to come, but that doesn't mean we don't have a role in being part of the larger community and being allies.
I think that's right. Not every class like this has to lead to us growing or,
It may not be inviting, it means something else.
well, yeah, it may be also growing in faith, understanding, and then following Jesus by serving or supporting others. That's a great point, Ryan, and I think what I'll do is talk to Josh and CE Commission and send out a survey. Probably not like tomorrow, but maybe in a week or two, that sort of the gist of it would be, besides our usual, administrative stuff. Was the classroom too cold? What steps do you think are right for Hope to do next? How do we take what we learned here and we're exposed to and make Hope, our denomination and the community better places? That's good, thank you. I think that's good, we'll do that.
At some point, in my memory, I think Pastor Josh had said something about, at the end, we discussed kind of how this church came to be in the community or something. I may have missed that.
No, I think you are, and I think,
Or is that something we just plain never got to?
I believe that Josh would have covered that today if he was not pulled away.
Oh,
Because that's a part of what he found out when he did his doctoral research. About I wouldn't say a myth. I wouldn't put it in to that level, but there is a story about this neighborhood and how it came to be.
but you aren't aware of that you can share with us?
So the gist of it is, and I don't want to do with Josh's research any injustice, but you ask how was this neighborhood settled? Well, and there's IBM came and set up here, and so a lot of people came in, and this was the neighborhood that they settled in.
TI was very close.
Right, and other companies. But if you go a little bit farther back, the real genesis of the first people that came to live here, because that mostly deals with the more recent folks, right? But it was white flight out of downtown Austin
Because of
desegregation and things like that.
which was it early to mid 70s? I know we came.
Well, I think it was well
We came
before
in
that.
77.
Yeah.
And our real estate agent said, you want to be in the Round Rock School District, not Austin, because of the controversy over busing at the time. And so we only looked at properties in Round Rock.
Yeah. But I think Josh he has a lot more of the research and everything, but he was going to use that
That would be
as
interesting
yeah.
to know,
Yeah.
especially coming up to our anniversary church.
No worries. We're going to wrap up here in a second. But I think that was Josh's intent today.
Is he ever gonna share his research with us? I thought he was, and again, I've been
He's
off
had
and on, a lot off and on, so I may have missed something that.
no. I don't know exactly because I'm not participative of it, but I know that he part of his requirement for the DMIN program is to bring his research back into his church community and show the proofs of the
Because
link.
I'd love to know
And I believe he has
more
a
about his research.
plan for that. Yeah. Okay. Shall we close in prayer? Do the closing prayer. Everybody set? Okay, so please join me in our closing prayer. God, make us instruments of your justice. Where there is a false and untenable peace, let us live with thanks. Where there is injustice, fury. Where there is oppression, hope. Where there is loss, fluorescence, profound darkness. Where there is spiritual depression, light. Where there is crime and poverty, a sustainable economic infrastructure. Grant that we may not seek to be uplifted as to uplift. To be seen as to see others. For it is in protesting the sin of the system that we can more fully acknowledge our own sin. It is in demanding justice of the powerful that we live out God's demands for us. And it is in rejecting the American dream that we are born into God's dream. Amen. Thank you all very much. I will send out, I will develop and send out that survey to everybody. I think, Marie, I will add your name to our distribution list.
I think other people, Mercy's not on the list.
Right, yeah. I think we have the rosters of everybody, so everybody that ever attended and to the degree we can see who viewed it. So mom and dad, get ready. I'll send you a survey. Marcelo as well.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for leading.
Yep.
Great class.
No, thank you, John.
So I take it we have no Sunday school for a few weeks.
Yes. I think the next, we're on like a 3-week break and then we do rally day and then we start our fall cycle.
So when is Raleigh?
I think it is September 9th.
So after Labor Day.
Yeah, what we used to call back.
Well, I think it was Rally Day and then it got called back to Church Day.
No.
I think we're back to Rally Day.
The past is prologue, right?
But anyway,
Thank you, John.
Thank you all. I'm gonna see if I can.
Yeah.
I look forward to reading it. And I thought the way they did communion today was really